Hello, and welcome to Under the Cover, where we analyze and compare books in ways that take you deeper, under the cover. I'm Katie, your host for this episode. Today, we will be discussing feminism in both The Crucible and The Handmaid's Tale. Let's get right into it. The Jewish people that Hitler imprisoned during the Holocaust were subjected to tons of unfair treatment. From the shaving of their heads and the stealing of all their clothing, all the way to the numbers tattooed onto their arms becoming their sole identifiers, they were given no freedom to grow as people, and lost their sense of individuality. When it comes to historical examples, the Holocaust is the most sad yet prevalent example of how the systemic oppression of people destroys their sense of who they are. There are also plenty of literary examples of how the oppression of a certain group causes them to lose their idea of individuality, such as the societies in The Crucible and The Handmaid's Tale's oppression of women. I'm here to argue that both The Crucible by Arthur Miller and The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood demonstrate that in a society where women are considered inferior, they lack a sense of individuality. The Handmaid's Tale, however, demonstrates this message more clearly as women are completely stripped of their identities. In order to prove this, I will explore two important pillars that help to construct someone's identity, both their name and their freedom, as well as their implications in both novels. Let's get started, shall we? Someone's name is a very key identifier of a person, and in this case, what becomes of a person when that is used against them. In The Crucible, the women of Salem begin to have their names thrown around very liberally by others during all of the accusations, and begin to lose control over how people perceive them. It begins with Abigail, who blames their dancing on Tituba. Then Tituba confesses and says, quote, "Then the devil come one stormy night to me, and he say, look, I have white people belong to me. And I look, and there was goody good. To which Putnam emphatically shouts, I knew it," end quote. As soon as any of the women are placed under the title of being a quote-unquote witch, suddenly everybody in Salem agrees and also sees them as a witch. This becomes a form of oppression because the women are all struggling with how their own names are perceived, whereas the men of the courts get to ultimately decide whether they are a witch or not, which, if they decide that they are, adds a darker connotation to their name. The men being able to decide who is and who is not a witch, while the women are the ones who are forced to turn on each other in order to save their own names. And that is exactly what keeps the men in power in Salem during all of this time. Conversely, in The Handmaid's Tale, their names are completely taken from them by Gilead, and they are replaced with new ones. Of Fred explains her name, telling the audience that, quote, "My name isn't of Fred. I have another name which nobody uses now because it's forbidden. I tell myself it doesn't matter. Your name is like your telephone number, useful only to others, but what I tell myself is wrong. It does matter," end quote. This highlights how their past names have been made illegal by Gilead and that they risk severe punishment for using them. Offred saying that her name does matter shows how she understands that her name is a very important key identifier of who she is. Even for ourselves, our own names are what we link our entire identity to. I have to talk about how their loss of control over how people perceive their names in The Crucible has negative implications on their own identities. Danforth says about Rebecca Nurse that, quote, "Mr. Proctor, a score of people have already testified that they saw this woman with the devil," end quote. Which is rather insane to me because all throughout the first half of the play, Rebecca Nurse is known as holy and one of the best women in their town. Suddenly, when her name is mentioned, her name is put under this terrible connotation that she is a witch. Even when John Proctor refuses to call her one, and with her refusal to ever confess, Danforth says that she is, and the courts say she is. Therefore, she will always have the identity of being a witch on her name, and she loses the good identity that her name was previously associated with. It's completely out of her control, yet her association with her own name gives her a bad reputation, and has changed how she is perceived by others. However, The Handmaid's Tale has much larger implications on the woman's identity due to the fact that they are entirely stripped of this pillar of identity and are forced to use their completely new names. Gilead's giving the women a new name gives them an entirely new identity, and they struggle to maintain individuality because of this. However, The Handmaid's Tale has much larger implications on the woman's identities due to the fact that they are entirely stripped of this pillar of identity and are forced to use completely new names. Gilead's giving the women new names gives them an entirely new identity, and they struggle to maintain individuality because of this. Of Fred explains about her shopping partner that she's been replaced by a new Of Glen, and says, quote, Of Glen, wherever she is no longer Of Glen. I never did know her real name. That is how you can get lost in a sea of names, end quote. This statement places weight upon the idea that in Gilead, names begin not to matter because they do not connect to their own identities. However, because their names do not belong to their identity anymore, they have no other identifying features. Of Glen really means Of Glen, the commander that Of Glen had been stationed at. Now that Of Glen is no longer Of Glen, what is she? There's no solid identity that comes with their names anymore. It's only really a notion of their position. Just to recap this entire section about names, I want to say that while in the Crucible their names are thrown around and the result is a loss of perception and control over how the women in Salem are perceived, The Handmaid's Tale offers a stronger take on the lack of identity because the women are completely stripped of their names and are instead given names related to their positions. Thus, their name is no longer an identifying factor in their lives and they completely lose that pillar of identity. On to segment 2. In this segment, I want to get into the aspect of freedom. Freedom is the next major pillar of one's identity that I will be discussing. Freedom is what allows us to craft our own identities, to make our own choices that define us. The women in the Crucible have a very specific role to play in society, and risk being vilified if they step out of that role. When Abigail exclaims that, quote, My name is good in the village, I will not have it said that my name is soiled, end quote, that statement ties into the freedom aspect of identity because if Goody Proctor soils her name, then it will come out that she is an orphaned woman who had an affair with a married man. Women are already very low on the power scale in Salem, and she would be given horrible consequences. She has no real freedom to step out of the small box that they are supposed to be in. Otherwise, she could risk being accused of witchcraft herself, since we've already shown that, at first, those who were being targeted were largely social rejects. And that would explain why Abigail is so afraid of her name being soiled. Not just because the identity that links with the name, but because they have no freedom to be perceived as anything other than what the men want them to be perceived as. The women in The Handmaid's Tale, however, are slowly yet completely stripped of their freedom to do anything. Moira explains to Offred in a flashback that, quote, Women can't hold property anymore. It's a new law, end quote. The lack of property demonstrates how gradually Gilead begins to take the freedom away from the women. It begins with Offred losing her job, and then new laws determine that women can no longer have a bank account or any property of any kind in their names anymore. The men are allowed to be transferred their money and to have control over it as a result. This causes them to need the men for support, and clearly demonstrates the gradual stealing of their freedom and ability to do things without a man's permission. Drifting back to the Crucible, the women having no freedom to defer from the strict societal norms, as well as the fear factor of seeing that those who are deferring are being tried and hung for witchcraft, keeps them from forming their own individual traits. The statement from Elizabeth that, quote, There be 14 people in jail now. They'll be tried, and they have the power to hang, end quote, illustrates the threat of all of these social rejects possibly being killed, and it scares the woman into trying to act normal and not to step foot out of the strictly upheld role in the household. Moreover, the article, A Feminist Perspective on the History of Women as Witches by Maggie Roseman, explains that, quote, The story of Eve, the original sinner, was projected onto women living in the Puritan society. Women were worthy of honor for being wives, but deemed witches if they disrupted their functionality in society, end quote. That excerpt highlights how little freedom the women in Salem had at the time to defer from societal norms. When it comes to conforming and living versus crafting their own identity and possibly being hanged, many of the women choose the former. Similarly, in The Handmaid's Tale, the women's loss of freedom results in them being unable to craft their own individual identities, and thus they are forced to fit into the men's strict standards for them, much like in The Crucible. Aunt Lydia explains to the girls that, quote, There's more than one kind of freedom to and freedom from. Now you are being given freedom from, end quote. And this statement demonstrates how, in the past, the women had freedom to do what they wanted and to craft their own identities. However, as Aunt Lydia explains, they are now being controlled so heavily that, yes, they do have freedom from, but from what? From crafting their own identities and from doing what they want. Their freedom is based solely on the rules that the men have created for them, which gives them no true ability to create their own identity. To kind of wrap it all up, in the Crucible, the women have a very strict role in society, and if they are anything other than a housewife, they risk being called a witch or even vilified. Their freedom to be themselves is greatly restricted by the societal consequences that are put in place for them. In The Handmaid's Tale, however, the women are given absolutely no freedom to do anything unless permitted by men. They cannot even read, educate themselves, or hold anything in their property under the law, which makes it virtually impossible for them to educate themselves enough to form their own opinions, have their own choices, and ultimately create their own identities for themselves. And there you have it, folks. That's really all I have left to say about freedom, so let's kind of jump into a recap and a conclusion here. So, how about we recap everything that I've just said? In the Crucible, names are thrown around like crazy with everyone accusing each other left and right, most of those names being women's. Because of this, they lose control over their own identities and they cannot control how they are being perceived by society. However, names in The Handmaid's Tale are completely taken from the women, and they're given names that refer to their positions. The element of their own name, which is an identifying factor, is taken and replaced by their position name, which doesn't really connect to their personality. They lose their names completely, and with that, they lose a source of their identity. Transitioning over into freedom, in the Crucible, the women have strict societal norms to follow, or else they risk being targeted in the witch trials. This keeps them in line and with the roles they're meant to follow in society, linking to their freedom to be themselves, which they don't really have, just due to the fact that they are meant to be housewives. Their role in society is to be housewives, and they don't really have the freedom to go against that, or else they will be targeted. However, back to The Handmaid's Tale, Gilead takes every bit of women's freedoms and forces them to live very strictly, and their only freedom or ability is determined by laws, many of which are very, very restricting and offer them no freedom. They cannot read, therefore they cannot be educated or have identities and opinions of their own. What's more is they cannot even hold property in their names, so they must look to men for that. So, my natural conclusion here, after all that I've said, is that because of how much more trouble the women in The Handmaid's Tale face when attempting to form their own identities as a result of the oppression they are forced to live under, it demonstrates much more severely than The Crucible how in a society where women are considered inferior, they do lack a sense of identity. So, much like the Jewish were ripped of their identities during the Holocaust, the women in the stories I've just discussed were also robbed of key parts of their identities, or the creation of such. Through both the historical example of the tragedy of the Holocaust and the literary examples of the women in the Crucible and The Handmaid's Tale that I've just used, I think that we can come to the conclusion here that oppression severely limits one's ability to reach their full potential and to have a confident idea of who they are as a person. When you lose your ability to self-regulate due to the control they have over you, you lose your own ability to craft your identity. So, that's all for today, folks. If you'd like to listen to more episodes of this completely made-up podcast, you can find it on both Spotify and Apple Music. For some behind the scenes, you can check out my Instagram at _thecoverpodcast or my Twitter of the same name. Stay awesome, and we'll see you next week.